Hey guys, welcome to Solo ReacTalk. Today I'm going to be reacting to the SQUIG games, Legend of KRONAN Da KUNNIN. This is part of the KRONAN Da KUNNIN playlist made by Baldermort's Guide to Warhammer. If you want to check out my previous reactions, remember the playlist card will be at the top. Just click on it and you'll be able to access them. If you want to check out the original video as well as Baldermort's Guide to Warhammer YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. Okay, let's start. 3, 2, 1, go.
Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, KRONAN, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. The SQUIG Games. Story continued from Orc Commandos. And so it was that the raid on the camp of Tooth Smasher had been pipped at the post, held back at the very boundary of victory.
Yes, Daka von Smashhoven, along with the commandos, didn't succeed in saving their war boss, and yeah. I don't know whose fault is it. Someone made a noise and then it alerted everybody else in the speed war. So I'm not sure who did it, but yeah, they tried.
For the commandos led by Daka von Smashhoven had been in eye-shot of their lord, their boss, KRONAN Da KUNNIN. But the camp had come to life, and it was a large war unto itself. Perhaps not as large as KRONAN's Kunnin war, but it was hardly anything to sniff at. Well, this was more to do with the fact that the very airs had been befouled in the camp. There was a reek emanating from its centre, from its very command structures in the Shumi conurbation that the speed war had captured. It was the whiff of corruption, of weakness, of lily-livered, cringe-inducing, slack-jawed wimps that had done the unspeakable. For some of the orcs in this camp were red. They had decided to turn their backs on the great ones, the true gods of the orcs, Gok and Mork.
But, I think I've asked this question last week. If orcs can, worship the chaos gods, do they worship a specific one, or do they just worship all of them at the same time? Like some people, some former Imperium soldiers or Astartes soldiers, they don't only necessarily worship one chaos god, they worship all of them. So is it something like that as well with the orcs that worship the chaos gods, or do they worship one specific one? And if it is one specific one, do they generally choose Khorne? Because I know with him, blood, fighting, death, it just attunes itself with the orcs, and with the other chaos gods not so much. So I'm just wondering about that. Yeah.
Now these vermin were less than a snot in the eyes of KRONAN. Well, when he could open them. For it was difficult to open his eyes, due to the crumpings he had received while in the gentle care of the speed war. But nonetheless, if KRONAN could open his eyes and focus on the camp around him, they would all have been degenerate scum in his vision. For they had gone over to the worship of the dark gods of chaos. The girl, the fat one, the librarian type, whatever that was, and the juice god. None of them could truly understand the nature of reality, for they were the pathetic fever dreams of the Humies and the Pointies. And the Humies were weird, and far too involved in all these weird and odd kind of whiffy gods that demanded all bow and scrape or take off their clothes and sweat all over one another. Odd
Ew.
in the extreme. Kronan had literally no idea why these humans preyed to such a lackluster bunch. Not one of them could win even a bogey-flicking contest with one of the mighty guards of the orcs. Now that does bring us onto the subject of bogey-flicking, as identified by the bogeyology of the mechani thingy, and then distilled, collated and theorized on by the Oldopinos of the Insquisition, or something like that.
Oldopinos! Oh my gosh, no man, the orcs gotta stop naming these things.
Bogey flicking was viewed as a rather unimportant nuance of the orc condition, barely deserving of any sort of real commentary, except to dub it as messy but mostly harmless, which was, as is so much involving the Humies, utterly and patently ridiculous. For the Humies could never understand anything that did not involve stomping around in lines like the Storm Boys, or writing things down endlessly, then sending it to other places, so other humans could write down more things about the things that had already been written down. To be honest, Kronan still suspected the Adipi R-starters, the Space Marines, were more orky than Humie by a country mile. But then, he did not really know what a country mile was, for all orky measurements had been changed to some strange thing called a meter. It had caused much argument about the entire structure of reality at the time, but then that was only between some odd boys, and nobody truly cared what they blathered on about. But back to bogey flicking. Sidebar. Concerning bogey flicking.
Am I hearing it correctly? Bogey flicking? Like the boogers in your nose you flick? Okay. Yeah.
It was the bedrock of orc society. It was the first step towards fighting and winning. Now the Humies could not fathom this simple truth, that even a youth would get if so pushed. Pushed being a round of unending thrashings until it sunk in, or a fatal beating was administered. It is true, but the statement stands. For bogey flicking was the base building block of all of the arts of war. For it was the first attempts at hand-eye coordination, applying the correct level of force, and the ultimate expression of accuracy. It was about hygiene, of course, but no orky orc cared for that. But it did clean out the nostrils quite effectively. But these first attempts at competition, at control, at hitting on target, these were the roots of all. Well, except for waddling up to another youth on one's pudgy little large fleet. The first steps, then leading to crumping them. For even at the earliest ages, youths could be seen rumbling, even in the patches from which they sprung. It was a sight to bring a tear to the eye of any true orc, watching as they rolled around and bit and thumped one another in the mud. Good times. Anyway, bogey flicking, as we have heard, was important. But not more important than pushing the plot forward, I am told, so sidebar over. Now, if you recall, which is unlikely due to the rampant waffling and sidebars, that the camp of Tooth Smasher was an expansive and sprawling war of its own. Hidden deep within it was Tiddles, the honourable and loyal pet squig of Kronan.
He didn't leave with Ducker von Smashhoven. Okay, so he's still in the camp there, alright. Probably he's gonna try and save his friend. Yeah.
Known as Nutcruncher, there were no real issues with the squig protecting itself from the roaming indigenous squigs of the camp. He was rather a meaty and bitey lad. So when the camp went into another bout of unrelenting celebration at beating off the Cunning War a second time, it was not difficult for Tiddles to stay hidden. And when the revelries and raucous carousing drew to a close, he slowly crept from cover towards his master.
I'm just trying to imagine how do squigs actually move, you know? Because they're this ball, like a circular kind of ball creature with two legs. How do they keep themselves balanced? And they don't have like, you know, like T-Rexes, they have those small little arms and the small little hands, or yeah, they don't have that. It's just, they look like a chicken, but a hairless chicken with big teeth and 6 eyes. Yeah, you know, so I'm just interested just to see how does this thing actually move.
Now our legendary hero Kronan was in a bit of a daze. On the one hand, he had seen that his cunning war had not forsaken him, despite losing in a scrap to another orc.
thanks to Daka, he proved that, there's still someone out there who wants you back.
For some reason, he was not forsook. And this was a strangely buoying circumstance. Yet the crushing truth still remained, that he was stapled to a dead tree in the middle of a sickeningly corrupted camp, and his boys had been beaten off a second time. So it was that when Kronan looked down to see what was peeing near his leg, not on it, he was actually elated to see the vista before him, for it was indeed his pet squig Tiddles. The little squig, measuring about 1.5 meters actually, wagged its body and looked up at its master. When Kronan did not come down from the tree to pet or kick the squig, it looked up at him perplexed.
Okay, at least I see there's a tail at the back. So it's not just this circular ball and the 2 legs. There's actually a tail that maybe also balances it out, So when it runs or when it walks, it doesn't just waddle like it's a penguin or something. So yeah, okay.
And sort of waggled more. But after no activity from its beloved master, it sat. It was looking at him with an indignant gaze when Kronan nodded down at his squig and tried to shrug his shoulders, looking at his arms and hands. Now the squig followed his gaze and also looked at the considerable spikes protruding from his palms, stapling him in place. The squig narrowed its eyes, took a few steps back, and then assailed the source of the constriction of his lord, and Tiddles embarked on a legendary battle. A feat that will go down in legend. Well, it would if Kronan gets out of this mess anyways, for he was the only witness to this Herculean effort. For Tiddles now attacked the tree with gusto. He bit, chomped, rammed, and slathered on the tree that had captured his master. He never faltered, never failed, never stopped. Even when Tiddles had consumed so much wood matter that he was constantly defecating in a massive spray out of his posterior, just to make space.
What? Oh my god. Oh my god. So literally it's just chewing and pooing all at the same time. Wow, this creature. Huh.
For the huge repast, he was unstoppable. Alas, Tiddles was no structural engineer, physicist, or lumberjack. It was only when the tree itself was swaying, so much of its central column had Tiddles removed, that Kronan knew what was about to happen. Sighing as it did, for no other response seemed appropriate at the time, as it wasn't as if he could shout at the squig, for that would arouse the camp around him and end his escape attempt. So Kronan's eyes widened, and then scrunched close as the tree fell forward, bitten nearly in half. Luckily, the real impact of the fall was taken on Kronan's face, with the tree behind it. Ouchy to be sure, but not life-threatening. For the old tree had already been on its last legs before the advent of the speed war. A clumsy metaphor perhaps, but it's late. And the power of chaos had also taken its toll on the massive flora. For it was now mostly hollow from the grubs and termites that had eaten away at its core. But we shouldn't mention termites too often, or GW may get squeamish about how much of their setting was ripped off from Nemesis the Warlock, and that would not be politique at the present. Well, it would probably fly over the heads of most who work there now, as it...
Interesting. I don't know anything about this. Is it like a comic book? Okay. Yeah, I don't know anything about this. Interesting.
Predates them by so much. Ignorance is bliss, and leads to the mirage of originality, I guess. But moving swiftly on, as I can hardly talk, the skit monkey that I am. So, as the tree fell forward onto Kronan, the entire camp around him should have burst into life. But this was not the case. For they had been celebrating quite hard. The proof of the pudding being the almost rivers of vomit running between the crude and pongy tents. And thus it was that nary a squig did notice. Well, apart from Tiddles, of course, as he was the perpetrator. Kronan was free. Well, sort of. He was no longer pinned on the tree, hanging about like some slacker, it is true, but he was barely more active underneath its girth, and he also had the enduring issue of the mighty pin through his palms. So he was still rather attached to the tree. I would hasten to add that it was not in any sentimental way, just in case my verbosity is confusing the issue, for he had no emotional reaction to the tree whatsoever. Well, apart from a large dollop of annoyance, but that was hardly anything to write home about, as Kronan was annoyed by most things, if we can be frank. though Frank is a rather hard-sounding name, so let us be Ernest instead. But it's not as if it's important.
Ernest is still a name, you know. It's still a very hard-pressed name. Ernest, yes. Okay.
Moving on. So, there was Kronan, once the most eminent prospect for the title of the very first boss of bosses of all of Aquilonia, trapped under a huge dead tree, surrounded by heathens and beaten to within an inch of his life. Still, he mused, Tiddles was helpful. As the thing regurgitated semi-digested tree and other foodstuffs into Kronan's mouth, Tiddles could see it in Kronan's unopened eyes. His lack of activity. His master was weak. Now most squigs would have taken this opportunity to simply bite the face off their would-be master and waddle off crunching.
Whoa, that actually happens? So these guys are not really loyal. They're not really loyal to their masters, the squigs. Oh, okay, interesting. But Tiddles is different. Tiddles is definitely different. I saw in that previous image, one of the squigs had little arms, but they were high up. They were like near the back or the neck or the head of the squig. So yeah, they do have little, arms. Yeah, it's just that you can't really see them on this model of what I'm assuming is Tiddles, yes.
But not Tiddles. He was a squig in a million, but this was only to be expected, for Kronan was an orc in a billion. Hence, he attracted the very best, elicited such ardour as to be messianic to many of his people. And squigs, as strange as it may seem to the human bogey-ologi, were indeed still of the same species. They were truly orky. Now one might imagine that this particular situation would be rectified at dawn's first light, but this was not the case. For as Tooth Smasher and his entourage were alerted to the situation, the camp exploded into activity again. Slowly, often staggering and belching and vomiting again, activity. But soon, the hillside around the camp was being searched by the very best Tooth Smasher speed War could muster. Kronan himself was privy to many an orc boss wandering up and sniffing at the scene. The dead tree, the lack of green smush at its edges, indicating a dead Kronan. In their mind's eye, he had escaped. For none could fathom his capacity for survival under what they considered to be a metric ton of dead wood. But let's not tangential into the weights and measures again. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the clouds began to open and the wind to pick up. A storm then ripped through the camp. A deluge of water came down and drowned the entire site. Hence it was that Kronan found himself in considerable danger as he watched the small basin Tiddles had dug out so that he could get food to Kronan, filled with water. Well, it was more of a canal now, as the water hitting the tree came down into this small trench, which, strangely, none of the Speedwar had noticed. But then, they did not seem to note a lot, actually.
That is just interesting. That is very interesting that they can't see that, Kronan is like under this tree branch, or not branch, but like the tree trunk. Like, you just have to look under it and you'll see. Probably even his hands are still a bit visible, aren't they? Anyways.
With red orcs wandering around the camp, which was a clear sign of unorkiness, it did not surprise Kronan in the slightest. Well, it would have done had he spent any thought on it. As he was gagging on muck and mud, it didn't really register at the time, you see. Nothing left for it. Kronan gave it one last go. He had to escape the clutches of the tree, or he would drown. Luckily, the torrential rain, the activity of the termites and other wood-eating thingies, the food from Tiddles to recoup his strength, Kronan could hear the cracking of the wood. But it was not enough. He flexed again with all of his might, to no avail. It would not budge. It was then that something very odd occurred. Kronan would later see this as divine intervention, as there was no other way to explain it. For the heavens opened, and the thunder increased. Waters came down harder, but in that instant, Kronan was blinded by the reflected light, as a bolt of crackling energy came from the gods themselves, and split the tree in half above him. Smoke billowed from the smashed trunk, and was thick in the air.
You know what? The orc gods are with you. Kronan, you are blessed. You are blessed. Okay? They are with you. What are the chances of this actually happening, guys? I mean, the branches, the trunk is not even standing upright. You know, at least with that, the lightning would have some sort of focusing point where it would strike on the tree, but it's actually facing down, and lightning still strikes at it. Kronan is blessed.
But at its end, Kronan found that he was free. The tree had split in two, and helpfully rolled from his back on either side. Now the shout of his adulation at freedom, or the response elicited by both of the trunk halves pulling the staples out of his palms at exactly the same time, was mighty. But it was covered by a thunderous resound from the heavens. Truly Gork, or was it Mork, or was it both, had come.
I think it was both of them. Wherever they are watching Kronan, their favorite orc. They're watching him and they're like, you know what, let's just give him a bit of help. And that's what they did. That's exactly what they did. Because this guys know, it's just highly, it's impossible. It's impossible.
To his rescue. Tiddles then leapt onto the prone and revealed Kronan, licking at him and trying to tug him into a safe place. Still deeply wounded, Kronan turned the squig around and placed the two prime fingers of each hand into the sides of its mouth, like a bit. Tiddles took his cue well, and then dragged his master into the night. Kronan awoke again, what he estimated to be only a few hours later. He was inside a dilapidated Hume construction. It had definitely seen better days, but at least the torrential rain was outside, and not pounding him down anymore. Kronan took stock of his location, his surroundings. There next to him was his pet. He would get the shiniest muggins and gubbins for this most loyal of all of his kind, if he could find a way to escape, to survive. It was hopeless. Kronan knew this. As soon as the dawn came again and the clouds moved on, the rains ended, they would be back to the hunt. And Kronan had a strong suspicion that his luck would not hold out. He could not flee. He was not strong enough yet. With the speed while surroundings being mostly plains, it would not take much to find him. He could attempt to hide, to gird his loins and harbour his strength, but he was unsure if Tiddles could maintain his cover, especially if he was seen coming back to this structure so often. It was indeed only a matter of time before the ball of teeth was recognized. So Kronan embarked on the most dangerous of paths, the most desperate of activities. He began to think. And now he had...
It's not that dangerous for you, Kronan. You've done this before. Should be like it's natural to you now, you know? But there's no Groths around, so how are you going to do it? Yeah, like there's no Groths around. You're not going to use Tiddles, are you? I don't think... No, he would never dare. No.
Been awake for smatterings of the previous day. He had heard some of the conversations of those bosses who had come to see the scene. And now he tried to recall these discussions, to gain an advantage somehow. For even with the support of his guards, Gork and Mork, it was not Gork, the god of brutal cunning, who could save him now. It was Mork, the god of cunning brutality. He would need to be cunning. Kronan begrudged the lack of Groths. He found it difficult as well due to his condition, for he had little to munch on to assist his mighty cogitation. Hence he scrunched his eyes so much it hurt his eyebrow muscles, for orcs did not have eyebrows, for they had no hair, but that is beside the point. Either way.
Why do I hear some Groths screaming in the background? Oh gosh.
It hurt as physically as it did mentally, as he tried to get into the zone. His memory assisting him for the first time in his existence, Kronan began to think. He had heard the knobs talk of a game, and later he had heard Tooth Smasher himself mention the initiation of new boys into his own tribe, his own mobs. It seemed that Tooth Smasher was now, after having defeated Kronan, being petitioned by many a youth and even boy or knob to be accepted into his inner circle. Well, his tribe to start at least. And Tooth Smasher did not like this one bit. Oh, he enjoyed the fame and fortune of being a boss, Kronan suspected, but he had no grasp of the logistics, of what it truly meant to be a boss of bosses, let alone a big boss of a war. It struck Kronan that the only reason that Tooth Smasher had a war at all is that perhaps he had been rather brusque with some of the applicants to his own war, had not let old grudges with some tribes go, thus forcing them into the clutches of Tooth Smasher by dint of being the only real alternative. And so it was that Kronan promised himself that he would never turn down a gift mob again, no matter how wretched. For, after all, minefields would need to be cleared. Humans did so love their minefields. Despite how potent this revelation had been, it was not really a solution to his particular situation. The press.
I think he should create like a gladiatorial battle for those who want to join up with his war, you know. If he doesn't like them, those that he doesn't like or those that he considers to be weak or, you know, wretched or just not really the types of orcs that you'd want, send them, group them all together, make like a tournament where everybody can watch them battle to the death, and, you know, the victor will join the war, you know, while everybody else is dead. Yeah, do something like that. You know, be creative, Kronan.
One. So he pushed on. He went deeper within. He attempted to commune with Mork himself. Kronan recalled the name of the game, the reason for it. It was supposedly an ancient rite of passage for the tribe, and thus it could not be ignored by Tooth Smasher. And thus did Kronan formulate his cunning plan. Risky, but anything worth doing is hard, Kronan nodded to himself sagely. He knew that if he was wrong, he was well and truly in trouble.
No, I heard you there, Baldermort. I heard you. Ooh,
But fortune favors the bold. Or was it the bald? Kronan knew only one thing for certain. It was time to nut up or shut up, whatever that means. The rain was not letting up, thought Earripper, the miserable knob on guard duty outside the expansive structure that Tooth Smasher had chosen as his command tent. Odd to call it a command tent, as it was a massive edifice, but that was the way of things. You can take the boys out of the nomadic life, as they say. Leaning on his huge chopper, Earripper looked out into the gloom when he saw something. Something very large and very angry. As it hoofed its way towards him, Earripper giggled with glee and snatched up his chopper. At last, a good old-fashioned fight. But when the dark shape got closer, Earripper now gauged the actual size of the thing. He had to call it a thing, for it has the strangest shape. 2 small legs, a bulbous body, and then a second body, and a tiny head on top. 2 sets of gnashers, one in its torso, one in the usual place in the face atop the rest. Earripper bounded forward, raising his chopper high, ready for the downward swing. But he...
Is this like a squig, but a different type of squig? One that can be ridden. Alright, that's interesting.
He had misjudged matters quite considerably. For the thing moved faster than he had assumed, and barreled into him before he truly came down, the top half separating and leaping at him too. It was larger than he, even in 2 parts, but the top half knocked him back and landed on top of him. In the moment of his impact with the ground, the thing gripped his head and bashed it against the floor until he passed out. Kronan looked down on the smashed orc head and crunched the front half under his foot. The sickening crunch was lost in the sounds of the storm. And so it was that the huge horde of Tooth Smasher was mid-feast when the doors were slammed open. And there, with lightning crashing down behind him, was a beaten and bloody Kronan, and Tiddles in the background, silhouetted by its light. Silence reigned in the hall now, as all could see the notorious enemy of Tooth Smasher stride into the hall.
I challenge you, Makora. Okay, that's World of Warcraft. The orcs and the horde from World of Warcraft, you know, if they have to challenge for leadership, they scream out Makora. Yes. So I'm assuming it's going to be something equivalent here with Kronan da Kunnin.
Well, stride is what he would state to people if Kronan was asked later on, but many would describe it more in the vein of hobbling or lurching. But that is besides the point. None raised a sound as they looked on, and so it was that Kronan finally stopped only 20 paces from the top table, where Tooth Smasher held court at its centre. Tober, the Chaos scum, sitting to his right hand, sneering at Kronan as he glared with undisguised hatred. But what was this? At the edges of the table, honoured but not too much, sat an orc in debonair dark glasses, slicked hair, and a strange black and white outfit of distinctly humy design. It could only be the talker, Chains Grand, Orc of Mystery.
Chains Grand. Okay, let me. I said James. I wrote here James Grand, but it's actually Chains. Okay, Chains Grand. But why are you wearing human clothing? Chains. No, you're not orcish enough then. You're not fitting the description of a true orc, you know. And I'm surprised that the Speed War has allowed you in, considering that you are not presenting yourself very orcishly like. Yeah.
But was he placed here by someone who had hired him from the Kunnin War? Or was he another turncoat who had thrown in his lot with Tooth Smasher? Only time would tell. Tooth Smasher silently stood, looking as regal as he could muster as he simply stared at Kronan, his hand reaching for his largest and most cutty chopper. Kronan then looked him up and down, then turned to look in a circle, to look in the eyes of all who were present, as he strode to the pile of sacks on the ground before the great boss Tooth Smasher.
Doesn't Tooth Smasher have a thong? You know, a throne? Doesn't he have one too? Or is it only our Kronan da Kunnin who has a throne? Huh.
They were in the colours of Tooth Smasher's tribe. Tooth Smasher looked on, stunned, expecting Kronan to hawk and spit on them, or make some other last-ditch offer of resistance. But his jaw slackened and near hit the table below him, when Kronan slowly bent double, and then came up with one of the sacks and held it above his head, then turned in a circle again to show all of his intent. It was then that Tober launched to his feet and grabbed a chopper, looking as though he would launch himself over the banquet table and into Kronan. But he was stopped and propelled backwards, slamming over his chair, as a powerful hand went a scruff of his neck and hurled him backwards. It was Tooth Smasher's. Kronan now ended his circle motion, and glared again at Tooth Smasher, and held up the sack to him. The contorted face of Tooth Smasher showed his ire, for he knew full well he had been outfoxed, whatever that is, for he was in a dire quandary now. He despised Kronan and wanted him dead. He could never dominate all of Aquilonia without that head stuck on a stick outside his home. Yet he could not break the ancient rights of his people. This was made very clear when the chief Yeller of Tooth Smasher's tribe, a sort of mad priest, came and stood at Kronan's side and just beamed at the boss of the Speed War. Tooth Smasher then just nodded and sat as the Yeller then bellowed that the SQUIG games would begin on the morrow, in an entirely satirical and very annoying way, if we are honest. And so it was that Kronan was escorted from the hall in silence, drawn down into its foundations. The sack was placed over his head for all of this, but when he finally could see again, it was due to his sack being ripped from his head and a boot planted into the middle of his left buttock, forcing him to collapse forward into a cage. The sack was then thrown onto his back as a metal grid of bars swung closed and locked behind him. Kronan looked around, and from the dark walked many an orc. But the majority were indeed youths, young orcs looking to better themselves. But Kronan also soon discovered that this was not only for the real hopefuls, those orcs who actually wished to join. It was also for punishment. He could tell this as he saw an old runt-herd in the corner, looking out into mobs of orcs there. For the cell now unmistakably held collections of orcs in distinct mobs, not a massive huddle of them, as KRONAN had expected for this sort of thing. Thus did KRONAN slap off the hands of other orcs who approached him to join their mob, and he walked to the old runt-herd in the corner and sat. Those orcs he had slapped off mostly picked themselves up off the ground, but not all. Even as injured and abused as he was, KRONAN still had a formidable right hook. The old runt-herd looked at KRONAN passively, but we could not afford voice actors, so he will thankfully remain silent. KRONAN just nodded to him. The runt-herd had held out his hand and indicated KRONAN to take something from him. KRONAN accepted, and soon found a hunk of meat in his hand that went straight to his mouth and directly to his stomach. KRONAN, despite the assistance of Tiddles, was still famished. The old runt-herd was mostly quiet, but KRONAN did gain some information from him. He was about to participate in what was called the SQUIG games, and it had 6 parts to it, all lethal.
You know, I never thought of this. I never thought of squid games and SQUIG games. I just didn't connect the two. Oh gosh. Because really, I think the SQUIG games is dealing with the squigs, but you know, it might also be relating somehow to Squid Games. I don't know how this tournament is going to play out, but it might have something connected to Squid Games. Yeah. Or this is just a picture here and Baldermort is just trying to mess with me. I don't know.
The runt-herd had confirmed he had been through the SQUIG games before, as Sasha really did not warm to him. Thus he was aware of some of the hundreds of permutations of the coming trials. Of course, it was rather a strange event for KRONAN. For he was then regaled with over 80 of trials that the runt-herd Suckbutt McSloppy had survived. It was 6 events that would occur, as that was the extent of the counting ability of the Yellows who would organize the games. But that was
not bad. 6 numbers. 6. I think KRONAN can only do 3, right? 3 or 4. But he likes the number 3. Yes. Okay.
Only due to them being trained to this level of mental acuity for decades, of course. It was no small thing counting to 6. It was indeed twice KRONAN's favourite number of 3, but we have discussed this previously. And so they sat in the metal cage, watching each other carefully for any sign of betrayal. None knew what the morn would bring. How many of them would survive to be accepted into the tribe of Tooth Smasher? It was very exciting, really, thought KRONAN. And not a much-deserved break from all of the bossing people around at the very least. In fact, KRONAN made a mental note to take more breaks. He deserved it, after all. Dawn came and the cheering of the boys outside was naught but a cacophony to KRONAN. Not being utterly imbecilic, he had made sure he was awake all night, just in case anyone got any ideas. Wiping the remains of one of the smaller other contestants from his lips, after passing some to his friend the runt-herd, McSloppy, KRONAN was feeling quite rejuvenated. Of course, the lion's share of the thanks for that would have to go to Tiddles, but it was neither here nor there unless he could perform today. So the poor youth he had chomped was just grist for the mill. One of the only others without a mob, the youth had tried to hide behind KRONAN, so he was conveniently on hand when KRONAN made his decision to chunk up on protein for the day's events. Of course, McSloppy was grateful, and was almost a shadow unto KRONAN from that point on. The contestants were then soundly thrashed as the doors opened, and Knobs and Yellows charged inside to force the orcs outwards, down the corridor, to some bright light. All of them trudged on, but KRONAN waited until he and McSloppy were the last to join the line heading out. Ignoring the feeble whipping and bashing from Tooth Smasher's Knobs, KRONAN made sure to be the very last to come out into the arena. For when he did, there was an explosion of whoops and cheers from all around and above them.
Yeah! Oh. Welcome to the glory proving.
For it was indeed an arena. Sand covered its central circle, wet from the rain the night before. sunlight already beaming down on it and vapours rising amidst the heat trails streaking into the skies.
Too bad orcs can't give speeches, I would have wanted to hear a speech from an orc, welcoming the contestants, welcoming the audience, welcoming the war boss, sitting in his chair. What's his name again? I forgot. Tooth Smasher, yes. I always forget this guy's name. Sitting in his thong and, welcoming the contestants and then giving us an announcement about who's fighting against who, yeah. Welcome to the glory proving.
Kronan decided, in for a tooth, in for a limb. So put on the razzmatazz. He walked the edges of the circle, hands raised high over his head. Orcs were far more interested in a good spectacle and some guts than any political machinations, so the crowd went berserk at this clear, unvarnished display of machismo, much to the consternation of the scowling Toba and his lord, Tooth Smasher. The yellers and knobs then corralled Kronan back to the other hopefuls. In front of them were long tables. On the far end of the arena, there were simple fortifications, a ditch, and a slightly built-up barrier of sand. But atop those sand dunes were some of...
Guys, hold on, my pen fell down. I'm too excited. Okay, let's continue.
The Speed Wars boys, brandishing shooters. Not big shooters like, but not small either. The yellers then indicated all of the applicants kneel. Kronan did not like this much, so just inclined his head slightly. As the rest of the supplicants looked on, the yellers brought out slightly larger sacks. And it was a horror. For the applicants were all then approached one by one, and their sacks replaced with one that has something inside them. Kronan watched on as the yellers sewed the sacks to the necks of the applicants, while remaining deathly quiet. Even the crowd were now calming down as they knew what was about to happen. When the yellers finally came to Kronan, he dipped his head so they could proceed to sew the bag to his neck, and he gazed at the thing in its depths. For there was a snoozing squig, a plump and round thing, and Kronan could not quite make out its type, due to all of the darkness of the sack. But it was more a mesh than a true silk sack or anything, so he could still see a bit. More light and shadows, really, but there you go. The gauze of the material had plenty of air, he thought, which was a blessing, as the sleeping squig was very pongy indeed, somewhat moist as well. When all of the applicants were lined up, squigs and sacks in place, the game was explained to them. Kronan listened intently, knowing of the danger he was in. For it would be a fool who would not bet on the fact that Tooth Smasher would be making absolutely certain that Kronan would not survive these games. Even Toothy wasn't that stupid. And it was then that he fathomed the depths of his peril. For the first squig game was simple. The applicants would run towards the fortified end of the arena whenever the drums went off. When they stopped, all of them had to stop too. If they got to the other end alive, they would move to the next leg of the games. Simple.
Just like Squid Games. Okay. But what's the penalty if you move and the music has stopped? Yeah.
Kronan did not chortle, however lame the challenge seemed, for he remembered the leer of the boys at the other end of the arena, and how their eyes kept following him as they nudged each other and drew fingers across their throats while tittering. The indication that the games had begun came in the way of a mighty explosion, and then the bashing of 100 drums in a frantic, fun-filled cadence. Alas, this is when all of the contestants, candidates, then discovered the nature of their squigs. For instantly upon the thunderous explosion, all of them began to erupt with explosive diarrhea. They were bowel torrent squigs. The sacks sewn to their orcs' heads were meshed, and thus funnels of liquid excrement sprouted from many, not just the edges, but like a muck spreader, it erupted from all sides. Kronan could hear his fellow applicants scream, slip, slide, and panic as they were suffocated by the dire dung explosions within their sacks. The more the others struggled, the more scared the squig became, and the more it defecated like a waterfall. This distracted all of them for the moments the drums were playing. Then they stopped. And at exactly the same instant, the boys at the other end of the arena began to gun the contestants down. Now KRONAN had a suspicion that this sort of thing might happen, so the first few shots sailed over his head as he threw himself sideways and skidded on the ground. He knew that the candidates between he and the firing squad would not stop them for long, so he took immediate action. His hands tied behind his back, as they were. He knew he could not rip off the sack, nor did he want to break the game, thus giving Tooth Smasher an excuse to summarily execute him. He instead invoked his cunning. Throwing his head forward a few times, until the squig was now right in front of his face in the sack, exploding with excrement as it was, KRONAN then rammed his head into the ground as the drum started again. And eventually, the firing from the boys ended. Not quite as the drum stopped, mind you, but it's hard for an orc to resist letting off Ducker while so much fun is going on. KRONAN took a half-dozen smashes of his head down before the squig was clearly dead. But more than this, a tear in the sack occurred, so its remains were left on the sands as KRONAN lifted his head. He could see, but the remains of the sack were still on his head, so he was not cheating. KRONAN saw them.
Yes, under technicalities, he's not cheating. Good.
Boys calculated the Ducker, noticed how the bodies in front of him were torn to shreds. They had continued to fire in his direction to the exclusion of near all else. KRONAN looked around and saw his temporary colleagues either suffocating, lying already dead, or lurching towards the other end of the arena while the drums continued. Only the old runt herd was seemingly in control of his destiny, as he made strange cooing noises. It would seem that no feces were dribbling or gushing from his head. McSloppy had somehow calmed the squig, and next to KRONAN the strange runt herd lay. When the drums continued, KRONAN whispered something to his friend, then bolted upright, the old runt herd behind him, entirely covered by KRONAN's mighty form. Ducker ripped into the area as soon as the boys saw their quarry clearly again. Drums or no drums, it made little difference from that point on, for the crowd cheered KRONAN as he made his power play.
KRONAN, 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 KRONAN.
Other orcs were being shot by the boys, but this was a minority, and KRONAN put it down to them not being able to control their urges to shoot anything that moved. Using the effluent from his now past squig, KRONAN eased his hands under his feet and up in front of him, tied though they still were, for his biceps were so mighty that this would have been utterly impossible without the lubrication of the squig poo. With this, KRONAN grabbed the nearest youth and held it in front of him as he charged the other side of the arena, McSloppy close in his footsteps. As KRONAN charged, he found that his me-shield was swiftly losing its use, so much flesh was blown off it. So he weaved slightly to pass a very dashing young thing that seemed to have gotten halfway up the course. The Ducker had all been aimed at KRONAN, in this segment at least, so the poor youth thought he would capitalize on the opportunity. Alas, he was now KRONAN's next shield. KRONAN made it across the length of the arena in no time, and finally launching his shield youth into the gathered boys there, knocking them down, and on them he jumped. The food from Tinnels, the repast from another colleague, a heady draught of adrenaline, all contributed to KRONAN now pulling a half-dozen of the firing squad apart with his bare hands.
Yeah! KRONAN, 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 KRONAN!
Before the Yellows intervened. This was indeed a sacred ceremony, for the Yellows surrounded the boss of the Cunning War, so he could not be executed when he was clearly a winner of the Squid Games. So the Ducker boys just looked up towards Tober and Tooth Smasher and shrugged, then went on to culling as many of the other sprinting applicants as possible. KRONAN had survived the first Squid game. He was one of the few, to be honest, as in the next few minutes the boys really did go to town. So a lot less came through the corridor and went into another holding pen with KRONAN. Less than a third. It was utter butchery, and KRONAN laughed raucously at it all. What a waste of orcs, he thought. No wonder the Speedoir was never as numerous as his own, but he had to admit, it was bloody fun. Literally. Things were a tad different in the holding pens during that night. It is not an event that is for the ears of we grots, so I will be vague, for it was soon discussed amongst all, and most knobs had come to the conclusion that there were only so many spots in the tribe of the boss, hence it would behoove them all to reduce the competition. Plus, this would have the wonderful secondary byproduct of providing ample repast for all of their mob. Now one might think that Kronan would be an immediate target in all of this, and the chances of the old McSloppy getting out of the pens alive were lower than that of a planet who had informed the Sector Inquisitorial College that they had a tragic lack of lube. But nothing could be further from the truth, for in his presence, seeing him as they did, witnessing his splendor, his sheer orkiness, made most of the mobs approach Kronan to be their new leader. Of course, Kronan stood aloof to all of these pleas, but none wanted to tussle with him, as his prodigious healing factor had already knitted or reduced the vast majority of his wounds already. He was getting close to his old form, which means that had he wanted to, he really could have just gone on a one-orc rampage and probably snaffled a lot. But being near his peak was not good enough, not to face Tooth Smasher a second time and be victorious.
He needs to be at full strength, healed up completely, physically stronger than he has ever been before. He should be at that point, and then he'll be ready to face against Tooth Smasher and anyone else. Yeah.
Kronan would have to bide his time. And so it was that the mobs were again bundled out of their pens and herded back into the arena on the next morn.
Welcome to the glory proving!
But there were far fewer of them still. When the youths and unfavored, like McSloppy, were all in the arena, the second of the SQUIG games was revealed. For dotted around the arena were barrels, and in those barrels was another SQUIG. The yellers and the knob bully boys all lined up the applicants and then assigned them a barrel. Then the drums began again, and it was simplicity itself. For the challenge was to reach into the barrel, take out the SQUIG, then remove its limbs and put it back inside again. Simple, easy, was what many of the youths declared. Kronan knew that things could not be that simple.
Yeah, what if it's radioactive, or it explodes in your face, or something? Oh, this is not... this is not good.
And looked warily at the sleeping SQUIG within. And one of the youths to his side bounded into frantic action. Bending into the barrel and snatching the SQUIG, he then proceeded to grip a leg and pull. Alas, it was at this point that the SQUIG then opened its eyes and wailed in a high-pitched screech. Then it convulsed, and a powerful warp blast came out of it. Drat, thought Kronan. They were weird SQUIGs.
Oh my gosh. I don't think I've heard of the weird SQUIGs. Or if I have, I've forgotten, but wow. They can also use the warp? Amazing.
They were linked to the warp and annihilated all who treated them roughly. The youth shuddered for a moment, as blue worms of warp power leapt into it and then coalesced inside its head, which then exploded. A round of them went off in quick succession, as the least patient or cautious youths all acted too swiftly. When the fallout had ended, the rest all looked up at the bleachers above them to see that the flag-holding knob was already a quarter of the way around the edge of the arena. When he made it the full way around, the judging would occur. If the SQUIG was not limbless, the candidate would be executed. Kronan looked down into his barrel at the leering SQUIG within. It shook, and looked as though it had been pumped full of the humus recaf. Odd, but not unsuspected. He always knew this would be hard, but the empty Imperial recaf tins surrounding the SQUIG at the base of the barrel were a bit of a dead giveaway. Kronan now took his time. He knew what to do. Kronan, as the cunning one, was a fast learner. He scrunched up his face and tried to remember all he knew as SQUIGs, but all he could get was the memory of Tiddles, or the cooing of the old runt herd he witnessed the day before. Hence it was that Kronan gently began to coo at the SQUIG inside his barrel. After only a few moments, this strange sound knocked the little blighter out. Kronan gently lifted its wheezing, snoring roundness up and looked at its legs. Now he knew. If he just tore them off, he was a dead orc. Really dead. So he gently positioned the SQUIG above him and took the thing's feet, then its legs, into his open maw. He did not clamp down as he wanted. No. He chewed a bit. Not too much. Cooing just to make sure, then chewing again. Until, sweating like an elder under a drop pod swiftly expanding shadow, he felt them come off in his mouth. He did not swallow. Oh, no. He knew this could be used against him, so he replaced the squig gently, and then placed its legs at the side of the barrel. To his utter shock, the old runtherd was grinning at him, having just done exactly the same, as both of them then looked around smiling.
Yeah, Kronan, 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 Kronan.
The playing field had cleared a bit. More dead youths. But those around Kronan and the runtherd had been watching, and soon half of them had performed the same activity. But still, even with the example, half that tried to do this could not help themselves but bite hard on the squig and wake it, leading to their instant and messy doom.
This is also similar to another Squid Game competition, where they would have to chip out, what was it? A sweet cookie, something like that, with a needle. They had to chip it out, make sure that it's in the shape, and then they can show that, they've succeeded. So it's something similar with the squigs as well, yeah, okay.
The trial out of the way, the youths and undesirables, the candidates, were then returned to their pens. But instead of a night of fun, crumping, assassination and edibles, the candidates were shocked to hear that the ceremony, the holy rite of the games, had been brought forward a little, so they would have the games back to back now. Thus was all chance of sustenance removed. It would be a slog, all right. And so, they went on to the next game. The candidates were all addressed by the yellers again, and were told to get into mobs. Not difficult for most, for they were already in mobs.
People are gonna clamor to be with Kronan, I can assure you. They're going to clamor to be with him.
But there were stragglers. Again, Kronan was approached by all, but he would not yield. He would not bow to another. He would not join their mob. So he sat apart with McSloppy, and only the mobless approached. Now Kronan was of a mind to just go it alone, perhaps with the amusing McSloppy. But it was the self-same slackbutt who indicated that they would indeed need a few more boys if it was indicated. It could be one of a score of games against the squigs. But this one turned out to not be about squigs at all. The youths would face up against each other, to show their strength against other orcs. And so it was that Kronan took his motley crew of some half-dozen youths and the ancient runtherd out to the acclaim of the crowds. For it was beginning to be something of an event, watching Kronan slap the hindquarters of all who faced him, head-butting danger and leering at death like it was a particularly scrummy-tasting squigling. But this time, he seemed to be out of luck. Despite his new vow, he had only attracted so many to his banner.
Interesting.
Now, some of this was due to the general lack of the mobless, for free rangers became a rare thing after the nocturnal battles and subsequent snacking, but even so, small mobs had been warded off of Kronan. He watched two of the bosses of larger mobs threaten smaller mobs not to join Kronan. Pathetically, many had been so affected, avoiding fights, taking orders from someone not an actual boss or nob. Kronan could definitely see why his Wa was the more numerous, and had actually gotten into a proper fight with the Humies.
Okay, wait, before I forget. Let's get ready to rumble! Welcome to the glory proving! Okay, we can continue now.
Smasher had raised a few Humie settlements, it was true, but he had avoided the open field of combat, despite being the speed Wa. From Kronan, the Humies fled now. From Tooth Smasher? And now he could see why. He could see why they had allowed the taint of chaos scum into their camp. Gork did not love them. How could he? They were not truly orky orcs. Kronan was thus unafraid when he led his team out. But then he saw the opposition, and his team's reaction to them, for they were now on a bridge. And across a large gulf of space, a deep fall into the waiting maws of a sea of angry and clearly ravenous squigs. There was the other team. But it was passing somewhat odd, for Kronan was quite sure that some of that mob were considerably larger than any of the youths or the hated. So his enemy had stacked the deck further. His youth, his team, they quailed. But he was KRONAN da KUNNIN. He knew what to do. Now, most would have put Kronan's gigantic girth at the very rock of the line, its strongest point. But after a brief huddle, the crowd saw Kronan take to the front of the line, with the old runtherd being at his side. He then chose the smallest youth to be at his back. Now, some might have thought that it would be so that only Kronan looked across at his foe, that he would hide the scrawniness of his team from his enemy, rob them of their confidence, beat them early on morale and confidence alone. Others might think it would be as Kronan was such a huge egotist that he wanted to be the best seen, was about to make a good end of it.
Nah, it's not like that with him.
But the truth was so much more cunning. He gripped the rope that went across the gulf between the teams, shackled to it as they were, and then in the last second, he turned around and dug in. Just as the flag was raised, the sign of the beginning of the tug of war, instead of him bracing, Kronan took the next orc and pulled its body away from its shackled arms, and then twisted and threw it across the divide like a very floppy and wet but intensely noisy frisbee. The flag was dropped as the body smashed into the front line of his opposition and knocked half of them over like dominoes. But instead of trying to win in a second, Kronan was too cunning for that. He then enacted his long game plan. He turned, only because half of the opposition was still bundled up with his teammates, who were still screaming, then snapped off the arms of the next one on the line, as each of his orcs then went berserk attempting to back away from the huge form of Kronan, who was himself trying to get at them as fast as he could, by only contained and constrained by the weight of the opposing team's tension. But as he bellowed at his team, McSloppy bellowed the simple command to get away from him. It worked a treat. Kronan rampaged forward as the team pulled back with such zeal to avoid Kronan that they bested the Chaos and Nob opposing team, and it was only when Kronan fell forward onto his mob that he knew they had won. The transformation was instant.
Amazing, amazing. Well done, Kronan. Oh, 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 Kronan, 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 Kronan. Wow. Wow, that's amazing. Using their fear like that.
Kronan bellowed again, but raised the hands of the two closest of his mob in victory. As they all slowly turned and walked to the edge, the rope between them had been shot away by colossal Darker when the opposing team had fallen off their side. Again, the Yellows would not permit a besmirching of this holy ritual, the SQUIG games. And so Kronan and his mob laughed and urinated over the edge on the mad SQUIGs tearing the other team to pieces. And Kronan and the mob only knocked one of their boys off the walkway in all the celebrating, which was deemed to be most amusing for the one-off event, but none truly wanted it to become stale with repetition. All nodded agreement and backed away from Kronan in trouser-filling, respect. Respect, of course. But this halcyon moment was inevitably and inexorably shattered, for the next game would begin soon, and that would be no team game. The candidates, were all gathered again and informed of the new game. They would have to pick a partner, just one other orc to work with. Of course, at this, Kronan realized that all of the other mobs now shattered, as the biggest were trying to get together, the smallest trying to find an unpopular whopper. But then, having charm or dependability, or any other positive trait, was not really seen as important in orkidom, so biggest was always best. But it was when Slackbutt McSloppy's eyes widened at this, and he backed away from Kronan and then made a run for it, that the boss of Cunnin had a strange inkling. It was so startling, the idea that flew into his head. And there he was, mid-spontaneous unelicited cogitation. He wanted to vomit. How could it be that he would think so fast unbidden? Was there any way to save himself from this horror? His own eyes widened at the exertion and exhilaration of it all. But he had little time. He would work out some form of anti-idea headgear at some point. For if hats could harness ideas, could attract cunning, then surely there must be the equal and opposite out there. A hat that would stop thinking.
I don't know, maybe, but why would you want to think of something like that existing, Kronan?
And all of this worsened when Kronan realized that this too was an idea. So he concentrated on his original one in the hopes that it would somehow fill his mind, so no more would erupt there. And here is where we would have put in a flashback to the other dialogue, if we had the time to arrange voice actors and the money to do so. That kind of stuff. But we didn't, so here goes. For Kronan knew that Slackbutt McSloppy was an old orc. He stated that he had been through the Squig games multiple times, obviously unable to please his boss, or simply too stupid to move away from a regent who hated him. But in any case, Slackbutt had prior knowledge. He had experience. And that look of wide-eyed terror made Kronan have the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, they would not be in teams of two, but something else would happen. So Kronan barreled through the few survivors to get to Sloppy. And he was right on him when the final drum was struck and the duos were set. Slackbutt whimpered a bit as Kronan raised his arm with his own, the signal that they were a team. Many a youth partnered up with their best friend or closest mobmates as they processed back into the arena again. But this time, there were big holes in the sand. 2 holes right next to each other, all across the arena, and the diabolic rite continued. The Squig game was closing on its last set of challenges, but woe was there amongst the pairs, for they were told the rules.
Let's get ready to rumble! Welcome to the glory proving.
All candidates would be buried up to their necks in the sand, so they could not move. Then a set of gobsquigs would be dropped between them. When the drum stopped, the candidate with the most gobsquigs in their gob would be the winner. The other would be left in the sands for the squigs to eat. And lamentation there was. For interminable seconds, most of these duos made the most horrible spectacle. And then the game began. All of them were encased in the sand, up to their necks, unable to move utterly. Dozens of gobsquigs were dropped practically on the head of Slackbutt McSloppy. None were deposited even close to Kronan. So again, he was being messed with by Tooth Smasher's underhanded scummery. But the aged runthead was not going to lose. Of this he was certain. For he began to croon again in his strange way to attract all of the gobsquigs. As the few that were not already making their way to the runtherd then turned and crawled in his direction, Kronan was in trouble. Deep trouble. But he was never beaten. As he looked around a tiny bit, he saw all of the candidates spreading their mouths as wide as possible to show the plaque and detritus in there. For the gobsquig is tiny, slithers around an orc's mouth eating the rubbish built up there. So all others yawned like statues, desperate to gain their attention. So they could
imagine.
live. Now, during his time attempting to show his own runtherds the art of origlotomy for the first Thinkmas celebrations, Kronan had spent a lot of time around the herds. Far more than is normal for an orc boss as he. But Kronan was now an orc of many talents, many skills. He remembered more than any other orc boss he knew. His mind was like, well, it's nearly there, tip of my tongue. Oh, sod it. An absorber of things. His mind was like an absorber of things. And thus it was that Kronan did the only thing that would possibly give him a chance. He played hard to get. Kronan clamped his mouth shut, upturned his nose, and raised his chin off the ground, and gave off a derisive, truly diminishing snort at the squigs. Difficult to fathom, I know, but the orcs are beings of few words, so their body language was far more explicit. Note, I did not say complex.
That's interesting. I mean, would the squigs know about that? Would the squig understand that, okay, this orc thinks that, my services, cleaning out his mouth is not going to work out. Like, how dare he think that I am not worthy of going into his mouth and cleaning up his, plaque and all other gunk that's in his teeth. I'm just wondering, can that reverse psychology actually work? Huh. Wow.
And it was like a set of free eyeliner to an autarch. Irresistible. The gobsquigs stopped. They could hear the cooing and wooing of the herd, slackbutt. But when all was boiled away, when every scrap of skin was seared or flayed away, and only the bubbling core of enzymes and amino acids remained, they were orcoids. And thus, they wanted a challenge. Initially, it was just the first few that were near him that turned and then attempted to gain access to Kronan's gob. And as they did, he fought them. Not at his full might, of course, as that would have been suicidal. But he gave off the best act ever. He whipped his head around, stretched and compressed his neck, tried to snort his nose or blow them away. But then they would gain access to his gob. And on this went for the next few moments, as the drumming got faster and faster, until the effect was so much, the draw so much, that the quiet gobsquigs inside the herd's mouth were now forcing his lips apart and clambering out to try to get some of the action. The herd tried his best to croon at them still, but as his nerves frayed, his notes fell off, his reverberation was off, and the squigs exodused from his mouth to join a war in miniature, the battle against Kronan. It was when a shadow fell over the two of them that they finally knew the game had concluded, and both were then forced to open their mouths. At first, Kronan refused, until there was such a kerfuffle that the yellows came over in numbers. This way, Kronan could be more confident that the count might be less biased. Slackbutt McSloppy, the runt herd, had opened his mouth, and two came out. Just two.
At least it's something. Others don't have anything. At least you have two. Oh gosh.
Then Kronan opened his mouth, and many rolled out. With a groan from the knobs behind, Kronan was declared the victor. Slackbutt was to be left there. But for some strange reason, as Kronan was walked away, he turned and McSloppy looked at him dead in the eye and winked. The last candidates were marched into the pens as the crowd cheered, as another door was opened and ravenous packs of squigs were released. The full metal doors were closed behind Kronan, so he never saw how many bites it took to remove and consume Slackbutt McSloppy's head.
Shame. I actually thought he would make it. I thought the other contestants didn't have any of the, the squigs inside their mouths. So yeah, I thought he was going to make it. Oh well. Your services are no longer required.
Not that he wanted to, really. It was just another curiosity. The penultimate game. So few candidates now remained. The other arena had been prepared, so they walked directly to this event. The candidates were then walked into a room which had an identical number of weapons on a table, one for each. Small knives ranging all the way to large choppers, like really big ones. And all of the candidates, were to choose one weapon. But Kronan had spent so much time looking at the doors closing on his last sight of McSloppy that he was at the very back. So, when he did arrive, the others had conveniently been allowed to grab their weapon before he even entered the room. Kronan walked to the table edge, then along its length until he stopped in front of the last item there. A wooden spoon. Kronan sighed and swept it up into his hand and glared at all around him. Kronan was chortling later, when they were led into the next arena, and there was a huge drop with strange platforms suspended by ropes, but they were awfully far apart. He saw the wielders of mighty choppers begin to sweat, thinking that if it were involving climbing, swimming or jumping, and not combat, they were truly buggered. It was short-lived, as the yellows declared that the weapon was purely to decide the order in which the candidates would progress, largest to smallest, first to last. All were bemused at this, until they went to the edge and looked down. There were squigs below, large ones, very large. The onlooking mobs of the speed war went wild, as the yellows explained that the candidates would need to jump down onto the squigs. If they chose right, they would be bounced back up onto the next platform. Well, unless they were rubbish at jumping anyways, which elicited even more mirth.
Oh my gosh.
But it was tears and sigh-splitting guffawing when the candidates were informed that half of the squigs beneath them were of an uncommon variety. Meaning that if they were landed on by a candidate, they would probably annihilate them. Well, more definitely than probably, really. But no one can ever tell. Orcs are very sturdy for their dimensions. But to keep things moving along, a knob would walk the perimeter of the arena as a timer of sorts, as had been done before. Of course, the said walker would alter their speed according to how well or badly it affected Kronan. He was no fool. He had clocked this. Well, when he wasn't wiping bowel torrent discharge from his eyes, but that felt like an eternity ago now. But Kronan did have to admit that this was all jolly good fun, though he definitely would not have put it that way, because he isn't English, whatever that is. And so it was that the candidates were arranged according to the size of their weapons. Wooden spoon in hand, Kronan stood at the back, growling slowly and deeply to those just in front. But as he was decidedly and irrefutably the most orky orc there, his mighty lungs and copiously shouty voice box purred like the engine of a land raider. All before him heard it, and the quailing that some experienced was definitely more about that which was behind them than the potential demise before them.
Welcome to the glory proving.
Now the first youths were truly orky, even Kronan had to admit, as they spent no time on the pointless course of deliberation, and just jumped off the ledge and onto the first huge squigs. But rather undiscerning and filled with the vim and vigour of youth, they saw no point in waiting for the result of the first jumper and just went for it. The two leapt off. When the one on the right hit the squig, it sort of buckled, absorbing the youth almost entirely into its blubber, then rebounded them upward as its huge rolls of fat returned to their previous spaces. The youth flew through the air and over the second and third swinging ledges. He was at an odd angle, and just looked at them longingly as he went over the other side and fell to make a nice little spatter on the ground. You know, like when you were cooking and drop some small droplet of sauce that when it hits the ground spreads out across half your kitchen floor. But none saw this final impact, as the onlookers were all falling about and slapping each other on the back and pointing. For the candidate on the left had hit his squig, and the both of them had exploded in a fireball that funneled up and singed the candidates looking down from above. Kronan now saw the walker. He was practically sprinting around the edges of the arena, and all knew that if he managed to get to the end, it would lead to the execution of Kronan. And the boss then saw what was happening, for there were mobs and even knobs who were actively impeding the speed of the walker. It seems Kronan was gaining somewhat of a following amongst the very boys of the speed war. Well, that or they simply wanted to watch the spectacle and not have it devolve down to a rather anticlimactic execution.
I think the answer is yes to all of them. You know, they're supporting Kronan and they're also enjoying what Kronan is doing in the tournament. You know, he's like Kronan is like their favorite, winning contestant in these games. And yes, he is getting quite of a following. And at the same time, you know, the excitement of having these contestants go through all of these obstacles is just exciting. Yeah.
Those were always amusing, but the squig games were side-splitting fun. So they stood about in front of him, talking, ranged in groups cheering, so that the walker had to go around. And thus it was that Kronan had a little time, but not much. The youths in front of him were bounding, and some now watched carefully, so that they could judge their jump, so as to rebound off the squig up to the next platform, as they should. They were nearly all of the way across, many exploding, of course, when one of the youths turned round on the second platform from the last. He had a mid-range chopper. Nothing to write home about, certainly not a first pick, so as to put it, but a functional affair that could certainly do the trick, for he proved it. When he turned on the next candidate, and as he landed on the platform, the youth gutted him and pushed him backwards off the ledge. The chain of orcs moving thus halted. There were a lot of hand gestures, usually involving one or two fingers being raised in some V formation, and there was mooning going on, as the other youths attempted to hurry things along. But the insults were coming thick and fast, and the youth in question just pointed at his chopper and waved the other hand, encouraging the others to join him. An obvious trap. This, of course, could potentially have held up KRONAN, but he was the cunning one, so he moved like the wind and thought and action were one. KRONAN bounded across the squig that had been found to be safe from bounty, until he got to the platforms where his other candidates had stalled. Up he jumped. When he landed, he took the first one and threw it at the squig to the left of the last platform. Then he grabbed another youth and threw it at the squig to the right of the last platform. The first youth's face planted into a exploding squig. The second hit the side of the squig on the right, and it did not explode. Alas, KRONAN was not really concerned about the vectors or angles, just a hit, and so the youth was jettisoned into the side of the squig, and then jettisoned again into the floor of the arena so hard that sprays of sand came up and glistened all over KRONAN. The other youths then grabbed onto ropes, dodged and screamed as KRONAN stalked forward. But he was no longer after them. He had discerned the real squigs from the exploding squigs, so his path was clear. Apart from this last hurdle, this last challenge, the obvious assassin planted in the pack by Tooth Smasher. So KRONAN looked and planned. Then he leapt. KRONAN actually swung the platform until it gained its maximum height, terrifying the youth still grabbing the ropes and trying to avoid him. He needed some speed for this particular maneuver. So up went KRONAN like a gymnast. Then he reached his summit, and then made his body into a missile by tucking his arms in and ploughing down towards the squig. He hit it, was absorbed into it, then fired back up like a cannonball. But all laughed raucously when KRONAN had seemed to misjudge it. He was fired like a dart into the bottom of the platform with the armed youth on it. He smashed into the middle of it and went straight through, wood exploding out and striking near all there. He was like an avenging green, huge, muscular and toothy angel of death when he burst up through the landing on the platform. He kicked a youth who was teetering on the edge down onto the sands of the arena. To a deafening roar of the crowd, KRONAN just walked to the edge and bounded onto the last squig and was bounced up onto the finishing platform at the other end.
Whoa! KRONAN, 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 KRONAN!
The speed war went absolutely berserk. In fact, KRONAN was still parading around the platform, hands above his head in a victory shake, when the last three youths arrived. The games were nearly over, and KRONAN was now in fine fettle indeed. He had fought. He had striven. He had consumed many of his opponents to regain his strength. His regenerative ability somehow enhanced beyond anything he had previously experienced. In fact, KRONAN now felt better than he did when he went into that fated battle against Tooth Smasher. He was ready.
Indeed.
Only one more challenge needed to be survived, and then KRONAN would be of Tooth Smasher's tribe. If his present course was anything to go by, then he would have enough popularity and support in the camp that he could challenge Tooth Smasher and not be gutted out of hand by his hundreds of knobs. KRONAN was nearly there. He need only survive the last squig game. And thus he thought, bring it on. The three remaining applicants all stood in the center of the arena. Now there had been 4 going into the holding pens, while the squigs were removed and the last challenge set up. But it was decided by near-unanimous vote that everyone was a bit peckish. And seeing as only one of them would be getting out of these games alive, it only seemed right and proper that the Runtiers sacrifice themselves for the other candidates, so they were in top form to give the very best performance to the waiting audience.
Wow.
It was truly an altruistic moment for the greater good, and he barely put up any resistance when KRONAN pulled off his arms and threw it to the others, then chomped to his content. Now, this was not something he would usually condone, of course, the eating of other orcs. No, not in his war. Snots and grots? Of course. Squigs? Well, that was what they were there for. But not usually boys. But needs must when the dark gods drive, as they say. Again, not that KRONAN would befoul his mouth with such a platitude, but such is the way of the world, that sometimes the most unappealing of metaphors is also the most accurate. And so it was that Kronan was paraded out into the arena to a standing ovation from the crowds.
Yeah, Kronan, Kronan, Kronan!
He strutted in as usual and waved his hands to indicate to the crowds that he could not hear them. When they exploded further, he even shook his head, then cupped his left hand to his ear, as he raised his right hand again, indicating that he could still not hear them, which drove the boys watching into paroxysms of laughter, and he...
Yeah, Kronan! Oh my gosh, Kronan is such... He's good with the crowd. He's really good with the crowd. Oh, wow.
Even greater screaming and baying. But the elation was not to last, as the dour yellers now began to try to drown out the crowd with their proclamations. Kronan decided he would be magnanimous, after stopping them with cheering thrice, due to his performance. He now stood sternly looking at the yellers, as they described the next game. There were strange chalk markings all over the sand. Kronan looked at them while the yellers explained this arcane game that the tribe of Tooth Smasher had developed. It was odd and complicated, involving hopping and zones and whatnot. Then Kronan looked up with a snap at the declaration that the rules are void if there are none left to complain about their breaching. Meaning he could utterly ignore all of this cobblers if he killed the other candidates. Kronan then stopped listening, turned his head and looked down at the two youths and grinned his widest, most toothy grin. The two youths furrowed their copious and overhanging eyebrow regions, scowling at Kronan mirthlessly. It was on, as some say. The candidates were led to separate tables, with a veritable banquet, a cornucopia of sharp, stabby or choppy weapons of war. Kronan walked his table, putting on a performance by picking up near every weapon and testing its balance, holding it up to the light to check its sharpness or studs, then summarily rejecting the weapon, with a shrug and a casual lobbing of it over his shoulder.
Show off.
Much to the amusement of all. Finally, he took two weapons and raised them over his head. The watching mobs again went into a gleeful fit of cheering at his mirth, his sarcasm. For Kronan turned on his opponents and showed them his choice.
Welcome to the glory proving.
Two tiny choppers, usually used for picking the grit from beneath one's toes, if one bothered with that sort of thing. The other candidates had still been deliberating. One might almost suspect it was stalling. But upon seeing this gross insult to them both, they turned and grabbed the biggest chopper they could. Neither of the youths took their eyes from Kronan as they were positioned in the starting places for the SQUIG game. Though Kronan found he now realized why it was called the SQUIG game, despite there not being a one present in this challenge. The white markings on the floor were indeed a really bad rendition of a squig. I mean really bad. Like if you got a donkey drunk and placed its hoof in paint and then screamed directions at it. Or if two orcs covered themselves in paint and then wrestled, which, looking at the patches of white paint on the yellows, could very well be the truth of the matter.
Orcs.
As this was the last challenge in the SQUIG games, the yellows knew their moment in the spotlight was about to end, and thus they milked it for all it was worth. Each one of them coming forward and giving a statement about the tribe and its history, how they did things, yaddy yaddy yah. Kronan thought it was nearly as long as the massed cogitation. It lasted for an ending seconds. Perhaps even minutes. Well, before Tooth Smasher himself stood up, and the yellows knew to clam up. A few of them obviously crestfallen at the lack of having their moment in the sands. Tooth Smasher stood and recited what were obviously ceremonial words. He bit them off like he was barely able to contain his frustration, as Kronan began to bounce up and down on the spot, intimidating his opponents. He was, after all, at least twice their size. He didn't really need to do any of this. All was certain, but Kronan had found that he sort of enjoyed the spectacle, putting on a bit of a show.
He feeds off the energy the crowd gives him, and the crowd also feeds off the energy Kronan gives them. So, it's a symbiosis of energy sharing, and it just gives him that confidence. It gives him that a bit of oomph as well, moral support as well from the entire crowd that is watching this contest. So yes, they're just giving off each other's energies and they're enjoying whatever is happening here right now. Yeah.
He would have to do something just as fun, but possibly less expensive in boys, when he took all of Aquilonia. For it now seemed inevitable. He would do it. He could almost feel his hand clasp a skinned and polished skull of Toothsmash in the palm. He could almost touch it. And it appeared from Toothsmasher's attitude that he knew it too. He was dressed in his finest mega armor in the midst of a ceremony with all of his war around him. Not a sign of confidence. Which meant it was a sign of weakness. And all could see it. He was ripe for toppling. And Kronan felt he was just the orc to do it. The short speech done, the flags raised, the drums began. There was no time limit in this last match, so the drummers started low and slow, hoping to save their best efforts for the final moments. The game began. The two youths circled around his left and right sides, trying to get him to turn his back on one of them. Kronan merely allowed them to wander around the place, even right behind him. They were so intent on their activity that they actually collided with one another, vision locked on Kronan as it was. And at this, his moment, Kronan did a standing leap backwards. He bunched his legs and sprung into the air so high he was at eye level with Toothsmasher when he flipped him the bird. He then came down again and landed between the sprawling youths. He stamped on the leg of the one to his right, snapped it like it was a 6-month-old wafer, and he followed this with a huge kick to the head. The youth was instantly unconscious. The other orc rolled up and took a mighty swing at Kronan, who leaned back and literally limboed under its arc, his head near touching the sand before he righted himself again and continued his motion with a thunderous headbutt. The youth's life savings, his teeth, shattered and fell from his mouth like it was a dental waterfall. All could practically see the stars around his head as his eyes rolled into the back of his head and he fell backwards onto the sands with a thump. Kronan raised his hands above his head in victory.
Yeah! Kronan! 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 Kronan!
The crowds were going insane. But then, Toothsmasher rose to his feet slowly. The mood changed as he waited for silence. It was a while, but eventually his war noticed his action and quieted down. Toothsmasher extended his hand dramatically and pointed to Kronan.
"Three orcs still live. The game is not complete."
At this, Kronan theatrically took 2 steps back, like he had been struck and was staggered. He looked at his knives, the ones he had not even needed to use. He looked at the youths on the ground. He stood there, head down, and silence reigned, and the tension built. Kronan walked to each of the youths in turn, raised his hand as if to strike, then threw away one of his weapons. A clear indication of disgust. He would not slay youths on the ground unconscious. He would not. Both weapons now discarded, Kronan's reverie was shattered by the furore from the crowd. They were more loud than ever before, and the chanting began. The chant that spelled the doom of Toothsmasher, the end of his rule. For the crowd chanted his name, slow and low at first, but when none of the other orcs around them bashed their noggins for it, the chant ripped around the crowd and gained in power with each passing moment. Toothsmasher was visibly shaking with rage. Toba, the chaos-corrupted whelp, surreptitiously slunk from his seat next to Toothsmasher and seemed to just melt into the crowd. But Kronan noted it. It was then that Kronan walked to one of the yellers and pointed at a sash, a simple sash of the colors of the tribe. The yeller seemed confused, torn. Obviously, Kronan had won the games. He had bested all. But Toothsmasher, his chief, had given his diktat. The games were not over. The yeller looked down into his hands, then looked up at the skies. And there, with the air so clear, the clouds gone, he could see it. In the years to come, the yellow would regale anyone who'd listen. He saw it. The grin of Gork. And he knew what he had to do. The yellow snapped his glare to Kronan. Then he shifted it to Tooth Smasher, as he shot out his arm and opened his fist to Kronan. The fist clenched the sash of the tribe, and he dropped it into the open hand of Kronan. The crowd shrieked and bawled in approbation as Kronan donned the sash. Tooth Smasher bellowed in rage, but was upstaged. For it was then that a strange orc erupted from his entourage and leapt onto the very edge of the arena so all could see him. He then addressed the audience there. "Kronan has bested the SQUIG games. He has won. But Tooth Smasher would rather force him to kill defeated youths than concede his win. He knows that Kronan cannot do that. He knows that Kronan is too orky to perform such a cowardly deed." Now all were absolutely agog.
I don't even think they understood you. I don't think they understood you, really, because you're speaking too many advanced words for them to understand. But let's hear what they say. Let's see the response from the crowd.
Not because of the content of the speech, which was pretty much unambiguous and irrefutable, but it was more his choice of words and accent, really. But, shock over, the crowds were listening all right. "Kronan is now of the tribe. He is of your own war. He has won with you. He is yours now. But will you have him? Or will you have this coward and weakling, Tooth Smasher, hiding in this mega armor? I ask one simple question. Who is the orkiest orc? Who should be your war boss?"
Kronan! Kronan! Kronan!
At Tooth Smasher did not lunge for Chains Grant. He did not drag out his best shooter and gun him down. He walked to the edge of his box and unclipped his cloak, then leapt down onto the arena floor. Kronan and Tooth Smasher were to have their duel. Kronan stood in his loincloth, tiny daggers now collected and firmly placed in each hand. Tooth Smasher, there in his best mega armor and wielding his patent power weapon. Now some might consider this a bit of a mismatch, a bit skewed to say the least. But Kronan da Kunnin, would not have it any other way. To be continued.
This is the best episode so far in the playlist. This episode. Guys, this was the SQUIG Games Legend of KRONAN Da KUNNIN by Baldermort's Guide to Warhammer. This is the best episode so far. I'm not yet complete, so for now it is officially the best. I really did enjoy it from beginning to end. And yeah, Kronan just continues to outthink, outplay, outmaneuver everybody, you know. And you know, he recollects information from the past and applies it in the present right now, you know. His knowledge about squigs, the knowledge that he gets from the runt herds, you know, those who are in his war, you know, he gets that information and then he tries to apply it in the here and now, you know. And how he also is able to become this darling to the crowd, you know, appeal to them, make them love him, make them cheer for him, make them just worship him because of the type of entertainment he brings to the tournament, how he applies his different strategies. And you know, the crowd just went wild and ballistic for him. If you as a gladiator or a contestant can win over the crowd, right? Then you're like, what, 60% done with the tournament, because you have everybody supporting you. And that kind of energy, you know, will just make you strong. It will give you that confidence to keep on pushing until the very end. And yeah, you know, Kronan, he had the support. He even changed the minds of what was his name again? James Crand, yeah. You know, James Crand coming out stating that he is part of the war now. He's part of you guys. He has won this game fair and square, you know, and now there's no way he cannot be part of you guys. He is a part of you guys. And now Tooth Smasher is coming onto the gladiatorial arena, wanting to fight against Kronan. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see that fight. It's really going to be interesting to see that fight. And yeah, this episode was good, really, guys. I really did enjoy it. I like how Baldermort, you know, kind of incorporated the Squid Games into his KRONAN Da KUNNIN episode, the SQUIG games. Yeah, I like how he added some of those games and made it into an orcish kind of game. So yeah, it was really, really good. Yeah, I'm gonna watch this again. Definitely. It was so enjoyable. Guys, that's it for today with KRONAN Da KUNNIN. Remember, if you want to check out the original video as well as Baldermort's Guide to Warhammer, the links are in the description below. If you like my reaction, please give me a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos. And I'll see you guys next week. Yay! KRONAN, 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 KRONAN.